Thank you, everybody who's coming in, who's just getting in. Thank you so much for coming. Joining us today. We're going to get started in a couple minutes here. Just let more people trickle in. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Just let people keep trickling in. But yeah, I'll just go ahead and kick us off. Hi to everybody who's joined us. Thank you so much for coming, spending an hour of your Saturday with us today. It really means a lot. This is a conversation on decolonizing conservation, and this event is for National Public Lands Day. We're hoping to envision what it means to be a conservationist, a decolonized conservationist, and how do we do that? How do we do land protections in a way that is inclusive of all people and lots of different ways of knowing? So my name is Dina. I'm speaking to you from Arapaho, Ute, and Cheyenne homelands. I'm the organizer and want to express my gratitude to everybody who came to join us. I'm gonna give us a few housekeeping rules. The session is being recorded. So just so you know, it'll be shared widely within the next few days with everybody who's attending. You can submit any questions in the Q&A box. So that's to the right of the raise hand function. And we'll try to get to as many as we can at the Q&A section at the end. And yeah, thank you so much for joining, and I hope you enjoy. I'd just like to really quickly introduce our moderator. His name's Gabriel Otero. He will be moderating and introducing the other speakers with us today. Gabriel went from the oil and gas field to being the Colorado Plateau representative for the Wilderness Society. And he works on conserving land from oil and gas development. He works on land management plans, conservation designations, defending national monuments, and other bedrock conservation laws across the Colorado Plateau. Thank you so much for joining us today, Gabriel.
My pleasure. Thank you, Jolina, for organizing such a great event around such an important conversation. My name is Gabriel Otero. I am in Western Colorado. As Jolina mentioned, I've done a lot of different work across the plateau. Some of the most important work and personally meaningful is around Bears Ears National Monument, working with the tribes. It's an honor to be here and to have so many passionate attendees. The goal of today's event is to leave you all with a deepened appreciation for, empathy for, and understanding of an Indigenous connection to the land, and as a result, get you energized and motivated to take action to protect public lands from an equitable and decolonized framework. We hope this is just one tiny step towards the world we envision, one that is livable, sustainable, and liberated for all people. We'll start off today with a 10 to 15-minute presentation from our speakers before moving into a Q&A session. Our first speaker is Dina Gillio Whitaker. Dina is a member of the Colville Confederated Tribes and is a lecturer of American Indian Studies at California State University, San Marcos, and an independent consultant and educator in environmental justice policy planning. At CSUSM, she teaches courses on environmentalism and American Indians, traditional ecological knowledge, religion and philosophy, Native women activism, American Indians in sports, and decolonization. She also works within the field of critical sports studies, examining the intersections of ingenuity and sports of surfing and public intellectual. Dina brings her scholarship into focus as an award-winning journalist as well, contributing to numerous online outlets, including Indian Country Today, the Los Angeles Times, High Country News, and many more. Dina is co-author with Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz of Beacons Press, All the Real Indians Died Off, and 20 Other Myths About Native Americans. That was published in 2016. And her most recent book, As Long as Grass Grows, The Indigenous Fight for Environmental Justice from Colonization to Standing Rock, was released in 2019. Our second speaker today is Regina Lopez Skunk. Regina was born and raised in southwestern Colorado, residing on the Ute Mountain Ute Reservation. She's a member of the Ute Mountain Ute tribe of Towak. She attended school and graduated from Montezuma Cortez High School. She has spent 10 years in the information technology field, working for Chief Dolknife College, the Southern Ute Indian and Ute Mountain Ute Indian tribes. In October of 2013, she was elected to serve as a member of the Ute Mountain Ute Tribal Council. At an early age, Lopez Skunk began to advocate for land, air, water, and animals, and strongly believes that the inner core of healing comes from the knowledge of our land and elders. She is a former co-chair for the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition, co-chair and education director for the Ute Indian Museum in Montrose, and currently is seeking a master's of environmental management within Western Colorado University. Currently serving on the Telluride Institute Board, Advisory Board for Great Old Broads for Conservation, and Torrey House Press Board. Regina has traveled extensively throughout the country, sharing the Ute culture through song, dance, presentations, and is honored to continue to protect, preserve, and serve through education, creating a better understanding of our resources, culture, and beliefs. A great foundation for a better tomorrow. Dina will go over ideas and concepts around decolonizing conservation from her work as a scholar, author, and lecturer. And the second part of the event, Regina's portion, will show on a more tangible level what these ideas of decolonizing conservation look like, so we can all be inspired and motivated moving forward. We'll start off today's session with a prayer recorded by Regina.
Moanam, Father, Creator, we humbly call upon you to say thank you for all the many blessings in this day. Together we say thank you for the wisdom, knowledge, grace, and guidance, from the first ray of sunlight to our rest under the moon and stars. Thank you, Moanam, for being with us on this beautiful day.
Thank you, Regina, for that beautiful prayer. In the name of community and a feeling of togetherness in this webinar format where we can't see each other, I just want to mention that there are now 105 people on this webinar, so many people sharing space together to learn and grow towards a better future. Now we're going to kick off the speaker presentations. First up will be Dina, Gillio, Whitaker.
Well, Bisnaxielku Isquist Dina Gillio Whitaker, and hello to everybody. I'm coming to you from the traditional and unceded homelands of the Ahoshiman people, Juaneño Band of Mission Indians in Southern California, in Orange, what's now called Orange County. And I was actually, even though I'm a descendant of the Colville Confederated Tribes, which is in Washington State, I was born and raised in Tovangar, the Tongva territory of Los Angeles. And so I consider myself an urban Indian. I come to be an urban Indian as a result of federal policy of the 1950s that we call termination, which was about terminating its relationship with tribal nations. So that's a real critical part of history. And go ahead and switch to that first slide. There we go. So what I just was talking about of this policy called termination, which was one of many phases of policy that the federal government had relative to American Indians, this all occurs within a framework that we call, and here I'm setting the historical context for you and the foundation for the terms of our engagement here. The historical context is what scholars more and more refer to as settler colonialism, which is a way of understanding the foundation of the United States as a colonizing nation. And settler colonialism, the way that we talk about it is, it's a way of creating an understanding of that relationship that understands invading populations, this as part of this 500 years, 5 century, modern era, phenomenon of colonization. It's widely accepted in the humanities and social sciences. Colonization has this very particular iteration in places like the US, where you have populations that move in, they basically invade the lands of other peoples, and they don't go home. And so it's basically a population transfer. And so in this iteration of colonial power and invasion, we say that invading population is, the goal of it is to eliminate the indigenous population in order to replace. And it does this in all kinds of ways with profound violence. And then it's ongoing. It never ends. Like, we can see decolonization movements that have happened in places like Africa and Asia and other continents, where the indigenous population remain in the majority, and then the colonizers go home, right? And the empire breaks up. But that doesn't happen with settler colonialism. And instead, what happens is society is set up that is built on the continuing impulse to eliminate indigenous populations. And so there's all kinds of ways that we can illustrate how this happens. And Bears Ears is actually, the taking of the land for one thing, and then also the delisting of Bears Ears as a national monument is one nuanced way that this happens. So, and throughout this history, the way that it happens is that it's about the legitimization and the justification of that violence to eliminate Native people. And, we understand that is, the term of manifest destiny, which is about the religious justification, through your justification of religious terms of, divine right, chosen people narratives where Europeans are destined to inherit the land while the ignorant savages are, doomed to extinction. These are very, very large structuring tropes in the United States. And in that narrative is white supremacy. Right? It's always constructed by a white supremacist narrative, which in the case of indigenous people is not always, it goes beyond racism, because the original impulse to eliminate Native people begins as it begins with religious religious and cultural inferiority in order to do this justifying process. It's not because of the color of their skin. It's because they're not Christians. And it began century or decades before the Europeans even got here, because of the Catholic Church and the creation of these papal bulls that end up becoming encoded into federal law called the Doctrine of Discovery. And so this becomes the foundation of the legal structure that now maintains that relationship of domination and paternalism between the federal government and and tribal nations. Okay, next slide. So this white supremacy, this impulse of white supremacy, this ideology, it's all of these things that becomes baked into the settler colonial structure that we now call the United States. And it gets baked into like these ideas of inferiority, it emerges into what we now know of as the field of anthropology, which happens, the emergence of it happens in the mid-1900s, and which is structured around the hierarchies, the creation of hierarchies of human beings that are said to be, in some phase of development, ranging from savagery to complete civilization. And of course, white Europeans are always at the pinnacle of that framing of civilization. And so this is what we mean by white supremacy, or certainly one iteration of it. And all of that happens and gets baked into the environmental movement, beginning with the conservation and preservation movement in that same time period, the mid-1800s, when we see, especially, like beginning 1872 is the formation of the beginning of the first federal park, the national park at Yellowstone. And then, several other parks get created. The national park system gets created. All of this whole period of lands needing to be preserved because the exploding population and urbanization in the East Coast, and all of this is happening at the same time that populations are flooding west. And there's this very violent process of clearing, of ethnic cleansing of the land in order to make way for these settling populations. And all of that collides and is conditional to the creation of these states, of these Western states, and these parks and these, these so-called wilderness areas. And this is a huge part of it, about understanding how the US, like one of the master narratives of the US, is that it's founded on, this vast virgin wilderness. There are no people here. And if they are, they're just a few, and they're just savages anyway. And so, it's in need of European land improvement. This is how, for centuries, this gets justified in the trope that constructs it. And the same is true for for second wave environmentalism. So all of those tropes, all of those frameworks, that thinking and ideology and even unconsciously gets brought with it into the second wave environmentalism, in the 1960s and 1970s with the Back to the Land movement, the counterculture, which then shapes so much of what we know as the modern environmental movement, that is now constructed by a matrix of NGOs, non-governmental institutions, both domestic and international, and which do so much of the conservation work that we're familiar with now. Okay, next slide. I bring a sensibility and a framework of environmental justice that I write about in the book, where I characterize environmental justice as meaning something far different for Indigenous peoples in the literature and the discourse and theory and all that stuff that, when we talk about environmental justice, what we mean. And so, all of this history has to be taken into consideration when we're talking about what environmental justice means for American Indian nations / Indigenous people. And so it really comes down to understanding that Native people have a very different relationship to land and place, and that they also have a very different relationship compared to all other populations in the US to the federal government as nations, as treaty-based nations. We have these political relationships to the state that no one else has, that we are constantly fighting to maintain against that eliminative impulse of the state. Okay, next slide. I know I'm cramming a lot of really complicated information in here. into a very condensed time period. So I'm moving fast through a lot of stuff. My work right now is working toward, I'm working on a new book that has to do with understanding privilege as not being race-based, but as being based in this displacement of Indigenous people. And how do we transcend that? And so I'm looking at it through a lens I'm calling a transformational land ethic. And I'm taking into consideration, environmentalists are very well known about, or informed about, or they know about Aldo Leopold and his, infamous, land ethic kind of ideas, and that he wrote about in 1949, and which was kind of revolutionary to to people in his time, in that time, where he said that non-human plant life needs to have rights too, and to have ethics applied toward it, the natural world. And then N. Scott Momaday, on the other hand, is a Pulitzer Prize winning, Native writer, highly celebrated Kiowa author. And he wrote about a land ethic too in 1997. And he his perspective is that, Indigenous people have always had land ethics, right? That's our societies are founded on and constructed by these ethical relationships with the natural world. And he's saying that needs to be built into whatever we think of as a land ethic. And so I'm kind of jumping off from there and saying that unless a land ethic, and I'm agreeing with both of them, but unless a land ethic it also takes into account this violent history of dispossession and genocide, then it's never going to be adequate for American Indian people. It's never going to be complete, and it's never going to be just. So that's the next big conversation I believe we're supposed to have, and we're having in the United States, again, going beyond this idea of racism and racial constructions as being that which defines these relationships. Okay, next slide. And I think this is my last one. What does it mean to, in my mind, decolonize conservation? Based on what I sort of just gave this thumbnail sketch I just gave you, it means that decolonizing conservation means that tribal governments and communities need to have equal share in management regimes. So here I'm talking about co-management arrangements with the federal government and state governments, like in lands that were Indigenous places that have been dispossessed from them, have taken, unjustly taken from them. So public lands, and bearing in mind that in the Western United States, 48%, almost half of all land in the US is considered public lands held in federal hands. So that's a lot of land, and that's a lot of co-management that really needs to happen. And the ability to do this also means that Indigenous knowledge can be restored to these management regimes. It's the banning of Indigenous land management that has led to so much of the environmental degradation that we see, especially in the West, especially with these the fire situation that we've been seeing. So restoring Indigenous land practices, land management practices is key here. Also incorporating an ethic of consent, so that's what that, a huge piece of what this means. Native people need to consent to what happens on their lands, not just consultation. These need to be incorporated into decision making. These co-management, co-governance agreements need to be incorporated into land trusts and conservation easements. So the governance systems, decision-making systems of organizations, NGOs like the Wilderness Society and like the Sierra Club, like, all of them that are doing land, conservation work, need to work in tandem and equal partnership with Indigenous people. And then also land back. We're going to be seeing this hashtag land back, giving land back, which is anathema. It's taboo in the US to think about giving land back to the natives who it was stolen from. This cannot be off the table. It cannot be taboo. It has to be part of that conversation, and part of what we mean when we say decolonizing conservation. Giving land back has to be part of that conversation. So that's the end of it. I'll turn my time over to Regina.
Good morning, everybody, and good afternoon as well to everybody else. I'd like to start with just having everybody quietly sit and close your eyes and just listen to me. I would like to do an exercise that I had the honor to do with the leaders when we first came together at the beginning of becoming more formally organized out to Bears Ears at the Buttes. So imagine reaching to the ground, feel her, our Mother Earth. Take a deep breath, breathe, feel her and make your connection with her. Greet her with a smile. Imagine a time long ago. Imagine your grandparents. Imagine your ancestors. See their movements. Hear their songs. Smell our Mother Earth. Smell the food being prepared. Take a deep breath. Feel your heartbeat. Feel the gentle fall breeze. Breathe gently. Now slowly open your eyes and share gratitude with our Mother Earth. I think sometimes we forget to just take a moment and feel what's beneath our feet. With all the good work out there in this world, sometimes we forget what the good fight is really about. And the picture that I've shared on the screen is actually the area where we got together as leaders, as community members of our reservations, along with several members from the Department of Interior who began the discussion and really started to lay out what it was that we were about to embark upon. A very unique journey, a journey of both tradition, culture, guidance from our elders, and a very unusual and sometimes unwelcoming world of policy, politics from the local level to the state, into our nation's capital, a place where we're not so familiar with or comfortable, but also something that I always like to remind people of. When you get to the nation's capital, it's really hard to find that ground beneath your feet. It's very difficult under the amount of concrete that's laid in our nation's capital. And that's one of the reasons I like to start with a little visualization of reminding us of who we are in a very human way. What is decolonization? It's an interesting conversation that seems to keep coming up a lot lately. And one of the things that I always did along the way was I would always sit down with my elders or my parents or my grandparents. And I'm very fortunate today to have a handful of grandparents and elders that I can go back to. And when I do, it's very, very much welcomed. They like the idea that someone comes to look to them for the traditional knowledge and conversation. And when I asked my father one day about what he thought about decolonization. He didn't quite understand. And one of the reasons that it quickly hit me was my father is one of our last fluently speaking Utes. He can speak our language without using one English word, which across our nation and through many nations, that isn't always easy. It's because of the past experiences of boarding schools and the various relocations that our languages have been infiltrated by another language, English. So when you hear our languages on our reservations, you hear the native tongue mixed in with English. And part of that is because they're trying to make that journey of translation from one language to the other. When I asked my father about decolonization, he didn't quite understand. He kind of gave me this look like, what are you talking about? And so I kind of explained it to him of some of the presentations that I'm going to be given here. And he said, oh, okay. So you're talking about taking something apart. And this was interesting because he said, we cannot forget about what was done. And we must not forget about it. We should not stop talking about it. But he said, rather, we should probably talk about it in a different way. And I think in that brief conversation with my father, I realized that decolonization necessarily doesn't mean like what we're doing today in the United States, taking down monuments and having all kinds of protests. It isn't not talking about it. It's about acknowledging it without honoring it or celebrating it. And I think we began to see that when many communities and different organizations began to turn away from Columbus Day, the celebration of Columbus Day. For Native people, we always were like, okay, it serves a good day for another day off. And that was kind of how we seen things. And that's how we see a lot of the holidays. They're not technically our holidays, and they don't follow our calendars of celebration. They're usually either before or after, but they fill the gaps of ours. And what we celebrate is very different from how the holidays on the calendar are celebrated. So when we began to talk about decolonization and conservation, I believe in conservation, and I'm a big supporter of changing how we talk about things. And that's what I took from my father. It isn't honoring what wasn't or what should be possibly erased, which I think some people would like. It's about changing how we talk about it. And where does that start from? That starts from a very personal place. How do I talk about that? How am I talking to my family? How am I talking to my colleagues? How am I talking to the world about that? So when I started thinking about this, I started thinking about some of the op-eds and essays that I've written. And mind you, I'm also a student, so one of my first assignments in my program was to write a land ethic. When I went back to revisit my land ethic almost 1 year later, my world changed and how I looked at that, because I began to ask questions, I began to seek knowledge, but it wasn't in a way that you would normally do in academia. It was me reaching back to my elders. It was me going back to my parents and having really thoughtful questions and conversations with them. And that really began to change how I started to see things. And like you see, it says the land is our teacher. That really became really one of my centerpieces, because as I looked at the threats to the landscape that held and holds our knowledge, I began to see how that was representing someone ripping a page out of my history book, out of my knowledge. And that was very, very personal. So as we begin to think about how do we talk about these things, I think that that's one way we can appreciate the wild open spaces. And just like Dina said, just because there were wild open spaces did not mean that somebody didn't inhabit those areas. We just use things as resources presented themselves in seasons. We may inhabit those places in the spring. We may leave them so that they may be utilized by other animals or other groups and move to different locations, maybe higher, like the Utes. We summered high and we wintered low. And that always presented some interesting challenges to the world of archaeology, because they said, well, we couldn't find existing places of where the Utes occupied. Well, part of that is because we have guiding principles. And one is that our grandparents always taught us, if you're going to camp at this location, that's great, utilize it. But when it's time to break camp, you clean it up and leave it as though you were never there. You leave very little evidence you were ever there. And that's a guiding principle that has been with our people for many, many generations. I had the honor one time to speak to a group of archaeologists, and I got approached after I'd done my presentation. They said, oh, so that's why we can't find anything. And I said, yeah, but what we need to do in changing part of that conversation is sit down with one another, which is, you know, a very interesting part of the work that I done when I served as the co-chair for the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition. One of the things that challenged us was sitting down and learning from one another, but an even bigger piece of that puzzle, using those two things on the side of our head, not necessarily talking and sharing, but listening to one another. And let me tell you, that was one of the most challenging things from a very local level all the way into our nation's capital. When it came time to speak to our nation's leaders, a lot of times they want to speak because apparently there's this one little thought in a lot of our nation's leaders is they're always making a decision based on the best interest of my people, Indigenous people. And we had approached it with, okay, we want to learn what your policies, what are the procedures to maneuver through some of the offices, getting time and presenting to individuals. And so we were challenged with learning, and we had a very fast and heavy learning curve ahead of us. And we accepted that challenge on very, very personal levels. Each of us committed time into learning that. When you go back and think about questions that when you do sit back and listen, a lot of times you're going to get questions, or I've gotten questions as well as others. What is the name of this location in this public lands area? What did that mean to your people? How did your people use that? And that was a discussion that we often got when we were in Washington, D.C., because they wanted to understand certain landmarks. I wanted to say I knew, but I couldn't. And that was because of policies that had taken place many, many years ago, but all I am is a living product of those policies. So in 1868, that is the year when the Utes were put on reservations. That is when we began to get moved out of these homelands for which that we had lived on for many years. And those boundaries continued to get pushed back, and land began to be taken away from us and access, so we weren't able to conduct life. When I was approached last year about a peak, I wanted to be able to answer that. I even wanted to be able to go back to my elders or my parents and ask them if they knew the name of that. But I was reminded very quickly by my elders, how can I answer a question like that when we've been put on reservations and told to stay there? We've been disconnected from this land. We didn't know how to reconnect with those areas or know what it is. So we don't know anymore. That knowledge was extinguished. So there's a portion of that we're trying to even regain. But this all sounds like a doom and gloom kind of story, but it's actually the greatest opportunity. And I say this in connection with the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition, which was made up of 5 tribes, 5 sovereign voices. And one of the biggest challenges at one point that'll bring this all together at a beautiful opportunity was with 5 sovereign voices, we had the right and relationship to proceed into Washington, D.C. and speak with the elected leaders and our president and his administration. Because of the sovereign voice we maintained, we were able to get to places that even a state or a county government would not be able to access. And that's a part of the discussion that many people didn't understand. What is sovereignty, and how are tribes who are federally recognized afforded that conversation where most aren't? As much as we could, we tried to educate as many as we could along the way. And most importantly, the nonprofits and the NGOs were probably the biggest group that we would have to impact this conversation with. A lot of conservation groups. We asked them to kindly step behind the tribes and let the tribes be the leading force in this. And the biggest reason was because we had sovereign voices in places they didn't. We were met with the opportunity, which amazed us because we weren't really sure how those organizations were going to respond to us. Many of them provided a lot of resources in terms of places to meet in Washington, D.C., supported us in ways like making photocopies, helping to provide some transportation for us if we were in Salt Lake City or in Washington, D.C. We had a lot of support, and the effort, again, was a simple fact that no one gets anywhere in this life alone. You need somebody. And it always brought back that one idea my parents and my grandparents told me. You get nowhere alone, and you're always going to need your neighbor. Utilize them and never burn those bridges. And if you do, don't be afraid to say you're sorry, because everybody needs one another in this life. We didn't get here on our own. I believe that that's a beautiful way to open that opportunity up to the idea, which was outlined in the proposal that we put together. We put together a very strong, meaningful co-management plan within our proposal. We were met with a lot of challenges in that request. And that was one of the largest reasons that President Obama really worked hard to find a way to legally find the grounds to keep that in the proclamation for the monument. Because members of Congress were going to challenge the legality of his power to establish such a strong co-management piece within the proclamation. We were very impressed that he managed to keep a good form of that. But when President Trump came and changed those boundaries and proclamated 2 smaller monuments, those important places of discussion and decision making were really taken out of that. And so that leaves us today to continue to challenge the movement of the conservation and co-management pieces within our public lands area. You know, it sounds impossible, but I'd like to just share a few things. You know, in 1969, Apollo 2 took 76 hours to get to the moon. Our grandparents would have never thought anybody would make a journey to the moon. That was impossible. You know, we think about the impossibilities. It can be done, but we need to do it together. You know, a lot of that reaching to the indigenous traditional knowledge and how a lot of the solutions are found in many of the processes, the uses of the traditional plants, they're all circling back around. And to many of us, we say, that sounds familiar. Why? Because those are those same areas that we grew up with. Those are the same talks and discussions that our elders constantly tried to embed in our memory, so that when we raised our families and when we were members of our communities and our people, that we would continue to live by these guiding principles. And I believe that the biggest part is learning to coexist. Coexisting with nature, coexisting with one another, beyond your traditional enemy ties. It can be done because the 5 tribes that came together as a coalition to fight for the protection, continued access in the Bears Ears region of southeastern Utah, showed the world that enemies can sit down at the table together to learn and listen from one another, and that all impossibilities can actually look small when we just sit down and shed that coat of ego and begin to learn from one another. I believe co-management is a big, big solution when everybody has a seat at the table and everybody has a voice. As you can see, when 5 tribes can heal from within and yet heal their relationships with local governments, the federal government, everything is possible. I never thought that I could ever be a part of anything so great, but yet so impossible. The only thing that I'm left to do as a grandmother is to see how we are going to leave this place for our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren and many generations after. I feel the obligation to do this because my grandparents, my great-grandparents, my elders and ancestors, they done that for me. This is the least that we can do for those yet to come. Healing, co-management, and keeping a positive frame of mind. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both speakers. Really, really lovely, informative presentations. I am finishing moderating because Gabriel had some tech issues, but gonna get into the Q&A portion now. We've got 13 minutes left. Let's get into some questions. Okay, so someone asks, thank you so much. Could Dina please speak more about a decolonized land ethic?
So, I saw that question in the chat, and that's from Priscilla. Is that Priscilla Ibarra, my friend? If so, hi, Priscilla. I wanted to piggyback onto what Regina was talking about how, on the individual level, we all have to start thinking about our relationship and our own ethic toward land. And I think it's interesting, Regina, that you were asked to do to write your own land ethic. That's something I similarly do with my students. I teach a course called Traditional Ecological Knowledge. And in that course, I have them, most of my students are non-native people, but because this course is inside an American Indian Studies degree program, we have we always have Native students in our classes, and the class that I teach is what we call community-based, meaning that we take the students actually out into Native communities, out onto the land. They learn from Native elders and Native people engaged in various kinds of land management practices still. And in that course, like at the very beginning of that course, I have them write me an essay, a very short essay responding to the question, what is your relationship to land and place and to Indigenous people? And, you know, not surprisingly, the kinds of answers I get are really, really different between the Native students and the non-Native students. The Native students are really clear about what their relationship to land and places, because they were raised with that knowledge. Their relationship to place and land are ancient. They are embedded in very different worldviews. And then the non-Native students, you know, it's like confuses them. They've never had to think about something like that. They've never been asked such a question. And so, you know, they'll usually say something like, well, you know, it's the house I grew up in and the neighborhood I grew up in and the town I grew up in, the mall where I shopped, and like things like that. They don't, you know, their relationship is sort of mediated really through capitalism, capitalist processes, and very transitory, because that's what capitalism does. It creates transitory populations based on economics. But after 16 weeks being immersed in Indigenous knowledge and hearing from Indigenous people and reading Indigenous authored work and films and stuff like that, at the end I have them rewrite that essay. I ask them to write another essay and tell me if it's changed, if their relationship or their views about their relationship to land and place and Indigenous peoples have changed. And if so, why? And if not, why not? And so these essays are an incredibly rich source of information for me, and I'm keeping track of it. I'm actually quantifying, I'm creating data out of it. And what I've discovered is that when people are exposed to the history and exposed to Indigenous knowledge and worldviews, it changes their own worldview in really significant ways. And so this is really important because, you know, this transformational land ethic I'm talking about, it has to happen on all levels of society. So if we want like a sort of a, you know, at the top land ethic that structures society, like a transformational land ethic, it has to come from the transformation of individual people's consciousness. They have to start looking at land and place in different ways, and then it trickles up. So there's like a trickling up and trickling down of that kind of knowledge that can help inform this transcended land ethic. So this is a huge piece of it. You know, transcending the way people think, as Regina pointed out, is key to this.
Thank you for that answer. Yeah, I guess after Priscilla, the next question is kind of related to some of the stuff you were saying. But when it comes to achieving, this is from Meredith, when it comes to achieving meaningful government partnerships, both speakers mentioned this, are the barriers more within the institutional structures of the state agencies, or do you think that the barriers are actually, like you're kind of saying, more within the mindsets of the individuals, or do you think it's both? And yeah, I guess if, Regina, if you want to get into that first.
The biggest barriers that I think the tribes and Indigenous groups have is with the agencies, because the agencies are so hard stanced on policies that sometimes have a lot of history and have been in place for many years. Several years ago, I was asked to be a keynote speaker at a Headwaters conference at Western Colorado University. And one of the breakout sessions I went into, which basically a lot of the department heads from the state agencies were in there. And excuse me if I offend anybody, but this is what I saw and it's totally the truth. I walked into a meeting space and there were nothing but white old guys who were just waiting to retire, who were not going to budge on anything new, no ideas, and discussions were going to stand as they probably began their careers in. And it disturbed me because they were based on a lot of hard stance policies. If we're trying to come in and help change some of that, that's where a lot of the difficulties come from. And tribes, indigenous people really tried to open that discussion up. But a lot of times we don't know those procedures and how to engage in those conversations. Sometimes it makes us feel like we're not welcomed in those conversations. And that's probably one of the biggest challenges that are met. And I venture to say that even some people as individual community members off the reservations probably feel displaced similarly the way indigenous people do, because they don't know where they fit into those conversations or how much their feedback or public comments really can help or not. And so I think that that's it. Policies is the biggest challenge from my view.
I would agree. I think policy is the biggest challenge because that's really the meat of the structural. It really points to the structural issues of how that colonial relationship is still maintained through legal systems, through policy regimes. And, you know, and all of that is informed and structured by the way people understand how these things have come to be. So it always begins with education, the way children are taught, you know, from the very earliest stages, and the ways that they've been that we all have been indoctrinated with these narratives and tropes of indigenous people as being, you know, native people as being uncivilized and savage and needing improvement and assimilation and all of these things. Like, you cannot underestimate the power of those narratives. And I mean, even, you know, like going back to my slide about the early conservation movement, you know, Henry David Thoreau is a hero in the environmental movement and the conservation movement for his, you know, really forward thinking. He was, an abolitionist in New England, and, you know, he was very much of a human rights oriented person, and motivated by that. But at the same time, and he loved Indians. He was fascinated by Indians. He wrote an entire book, The Maine Woods, about his relationship with these two Penobscot native men. But at the same time, he was also a product of his times, where he believed that they needed Christianizing, they needed civilizing, and that they were doomed to disappear. I mean, these are what he, you know, so he's as progressive as we sometimes think of him. He was actually just a man of his times, as was John Muir, a man of his times. Like, his racism, you know, where there's so much public talk about him these days, as, you know, this exceptionally racist person, but let's understand that John Muir was just a man of his times as well. I mean, this was the norm. This was, you know, white settler society is structured by these white supremacist foundations. And, you know, that's not to give them a pass, either one of them, because I don't give them a pass. But understanding that this is so deeply embedded in the American mind and social and legal landscape, that we cannot underestimate that. And that's, you know, if we want to get to that transformational ethic, we have to dismantle all of those tropes, expose them for what they are, and change them around.
Thank you both for those answers. I guess we have time for one more. If you have to log off, you can go ahead and do that, and this will be recorded and emailed to you after. Just the last question, since I see so many people asking about it, and it's related to what we were just talking about, just like the same way government organizations are rooted in white supremacy and a really, really flawed and unjust history, so are NGOs in a lot of ways. And so white conservationists only, Christine asked this specifically, and a lot of people are asking about NGOs. And Christine asks, I worry that white conservationists will only work with Indigenous peoples when they have assurances that will result in protection in the classical Western sense. So basically, how can conservation groups be better allies when it comes to supporting self-determination in its truest sense, not just when it results in a predetermined definition of conservation? And I guess we can go Regina first again if you want to talk a bit about Bears Ears, and then Dina.
Well, I think because of that big old general question of yours may address many different areas. I think you can almost begin to do the work by focusing it on one campaign or one issue, because we can't change the world with one quick answer, a yes or no. There's no blanket or magic wand. And the way we done our work was we had a plan, and we had to approach it from the standpoint of how our tribal leadership individually would handle those discussions. And sometimes part of the education for conservation groups and maybe other NGOs is taking a moment and really looking at the Indigenous people of the area that you're looking to work with, and learning what some of their hardships and how their governments operate today. And then how things may look different from the way they were many hundreds of years ago. And I think that was probably one of the best things that we could have done with our nonprofits and NGOs, was ask them that, traditionally speaking, our chiefs made those trips into Washington, D.C., and got those conversations with the presidents at different times and spoke with leaders. And that's what we were asking them to do, to honor our sovereign voices. But not necessarily, we weren't also asking for somebody to cure our problems, because we were human beings just like they were, looking to help continue access for our traditional and customary reasons. And also learning about what their organizations stand for, learning what their philosophies were. As you heard on my biography, I actually sit as an advisor for one conservation group. I've engaged on a lot of conversations, and a lot of conservation groups are asking thoughtful questions. And I think that it's just about how we have those conversations to begin with.
So I was scrolling through the chat and seeing what some of the questions were too, and I there's several questions, wondering, how do you take this conversation into those boardrooms of conservation organizations and have this conversation about, increasing Indigenous voice and participation. And I think, for me, like my, approach, like I mince no words, and so I'll, call it out, like white supremacy. And when I see it, name it. And, we that's just my approach, and everybody's got their own approach, but I have seen it. It's been directed at me in ways that are pretty unconscionable, like, wanting, so-called progressive white male voice people really influential in the conservation and environmental movement who feel threatened by some of this information on all kinds of really complex levels, it appears to me. But I think that it has to be, we have to talk about this in ways that are productive. We don't want to devolve into name calling and accusations and stuff like that, but understanding, the depth to which white supremacy does invade and construct all of these relationships has to be called out. And when it's happening, to be pointed out. And like Regina said earlier, like, open your ears, have to be willing to listen. There is a point at which white you know, white people inside those rooms, inside those spaces need to just stop and listen to what Native people are saying and feel and stop feeling like they can control, like they have the upper hand, and just allow that space for Native people to be and to express their truths, express their histories, and all that kind of stuff. So there has to be an opening for that. There has to be a humbling. Like white people in these spaces have to, you know, be willing to humble themselves and hear hard truths.
Awesome. Thank you for those honest answers. Really important to talk about, especially it's a Wilderness Society event and everything. So definitely a relevant conversation. Just to finish things up, big thank you again to the speakers. I can't thank you both enough, honestly. And before people leave, don't sign off quite yet, because we have a call to action. So something that you can do, it takes 2 minutes. The Wilderness Society is working with the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and the Gwich'in people to protect this piece of land from Chevron, specifically, oil and gas giant Chevron. You probably know a lot about what's going on already since it's really in the news, but if you can enter this link, I'll keep it up here. This will bring you, it'll bring you to this page, and you just fill out your name and your email and everything. And then you'll be writing to the CEO, just urging them to not bid the Arctic Refuge. So I'll leave that up just for a minute. And I'll send it around in an email at the end too, so. Okay, in conclusion, thank you guys so much for coming. This is just an hour-long conversation. There's obviously so many facets of decolonization. And you know, we're scratching the surface here, but there's so many more conversations to be had. And this was a really good use of time and a really good space. And I just wanna thank both Dina and Regina again for sharing their insights, their knowledge, their experiences. It means so much, so thank you.
Thank you, it was a great conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming, everybody.
Thank you all.